So Lawrence Thurston in 1904 wrote the book, The Fundamental Laws of Hawaii. And it was sort of a sequence or a genealogy of what those laws were, starting with the Constitution of 1840, which some people would argue isn't the first law. You know, there was the law of the splinter paddle and things like that. But it's a more or less reasonable place for him to start. First Constitution, the second Constitution, the third, and then the illegal Constitution in 1887, the Bayonet Constitution, which we talked about before. And everything seems okay until you get to the Republic of Hawaii, and then you have the Treaty of Annexation in 1897, and then the Joint Resolution of Annexation in 1898. What's the problem with this sequence here?
There was never any treaty.
Okay. Yeah, there was a piece of paper, but it wasn't ratified by the Senate, and so that treaty never had any legal force. And also, if you had a treaty here, you wouldn't need a joint resolution here to accomplish the same effect. So the reason I thought this was really interesting is that in a theoretical sense, like using the theories of two philosophers, Michel Foucault and Friedrich Nietzsche, genealogy doesn't mean sequence, it means the opposite of sequence, a rupture, a radical break. So a lot of times we're told that there's these sequences, we got where we are because our forebears did this and it all led to this, but when we look more closely, there's all these breaks in that. So for example, the Greeks in Greece today, they think that they're the ancestors and the descendants of the great Greek civilizations. They really aren't. There's migrants who came in the meantime, and they're mostly the descendants of those people. They're not the descendants of Plato and Aristotle. They're not. So that's the same kind of, there's these ruptures. So we're told these histories, and yet they have these breaks in them. They're just not true. So here's another sequence that has ruptures in it. The sequence of the control of crown lands. So yeah, it starts with the Mahele in 1848. They were owned by Kamehameha III and the Fourth, and then eventually the Liʻu Kalani. And then all of a sudden, the provisional government hands them over to the federal government. And yet the crown lands were private. They were private property. They were, at the point of annexation, they were taken with the public lands of the kingdom and blended into one set of lands called the ceded lands and just passed along, or ceded. Ceded means transferred. In fact, it means transferred by treaty. And as we've seen, there was no treaty, there was no cession, nothing was ceded. Least of all, private property called the crown lands. In 1910, Liʻu Kalani tried to sue the United States, saying that she owned the crown lands, and they said, no, back here under Kamehameha IV, it was made public property. And that's highly, highly debatable. And so when we get to now, where we have lawsuits about the ceded lands, we see that it's not at all clear that the state controls those lands. There's breaks again. So the title of the dissertation, A Genealogy of Native Tenant Rights, is talking about genealogy in this sense of breakage as much as sequence. It's the opposite. Okay. So first of all, genealogy. So this is pretty theoretical, but I was trying to blend together the two meanings of genealogy: one sequence and one rupture. This is David Malo, the kind of the first Hawaiian scholar in the Western tradition, and when he writes about genealogy, he says that it's interesting that there are multiple accounts of how Hawaiians got here, origins. And then he says, it is in the genealogies that we see the discrepancies in this regard. So genealogies are always multiple. You know, people say this person is the king because they are the descendant of so-and-so. Often there's more of an assertion of power than an actual sequence there that leads to that. Like Kamehameha, for example, he wasn't the highest ranking chief of his time. And so his getting to the throne was as much about his actions as who he was in terms of his lineage. So Hawaiians are actually pretty comfortable with these breaks. And even Lilikala Kamelehiwa, who's a current Hawaiian scholar, says it's the mana in the names that's important more than the fact that they connect back and back to the origin. So genealogies are always political. Just let me know if you have any questions. What I was trying to do in this presentation originally was show how each of my chapters of my dissertation was original. I think my idea about genealogy takes the ideas of, I don't know if people know Noe Goodyear Kaopua. She just published The Value of Hawaii 2, and she wrote a book about charter schools called The Seeds We Planted. She had genealogy was like her method for that book, and I kind of took it to one more step of bringing the two together. And that's what was original in chapter 1. In chapter 2, I took a lot of the descriptions of traditional Hawaiian land tenure, how the land system worked in the past, and a lot of them are like a paragraph. And so by looking in many different fields, I made probably the longest treatment of traditional Hawaiian land tenure that exists. That's what was original about my chapter 2. And some of the things we find about land for Hawaiians is that, if you look at this picture, there's a couple of boundaries. There's a fence here, but most of the boundaries of land are in the mind of this chief. They're understood. Whereas if you look at a contemporary picture, there's fences all over the place. They're actually marked on the land. Hawaiians have those boundaries in their heads. And that's why a lot of times people, when they're traveling around the island, they don't even know what ahupua'a they're in until recently when they started putting up the signs. Like actually, when I interviewed for this job, I was talking about how I would like to have the students relate to this place. Does anybody know what ahupua'a we're in?
He'eia.
He'eia. And I said, we're in He'eia, right? And one of the interviewers, Hawaiian guy, goes, this is Kanayohe. But like a few months later, as I was driving in, I noticed a sign right by the entrance where it says, does it say, it says He'eia, right? If you're coming this way, it says He'eia, which means we were both right in the sense that part of the campus is in Kanayohe, but part of it's in He'eia. The part we were sitting in was in He'eia, and most of the campus is in He'eia, so I had my little revenge there. But just knowing where you are was something that at first originally had to be in your head, and nowadays we can actually see the lines on the land, even the ahupua'a boundaries very recently. Even in Honolulu, right, you see at the corner of King Street and Ke'aumoku is a sign that says Honolulu starts here, or the Waikiki starts here, Honolulu, boundary between Waikiki and Honolulu. So this is like a more modern land boundary. So when you went from that previous picture to this, now you've got lines all on the land, and the land is a productive economic unit. And that's the difference in the Hawaiian way of thinking about land and a Western way. Now the land is there to produce economically for its owners. And that transition is really what we're looking at. This is the system that I described in the last PowerPoint, that land is there to benefit you. Whereas Hawaiians would say the land is higher than us, right? That the land is a chief, we are the servants. We are kawa, servant, not just servants. Pretty low servants, even slaves, right? Kawa could mean slaves. So, what I was trying to show in this research is that land for Hawaiians has a lot of layers. This is what we think when we think of landowners. When we think of land, real estate, we just think of this: fee simple, right? Owning it. But in the Hawaiian legal system in the kingdom, there's 3 types of ownerships, all of which still exist. There's fee simple, which can be passed on can be leased out to somebody else. That's why these 2 are connected. It can be leased out. At the end of the lease, whatever's on that land reverts back to the fee simple owner. Right, so we see that in Kailua. Those new buildings that they're building in Kailua, those nice ones, those were leasehold apartments that people were living in and owning, and then the leases ended, and they ended up owning absolutely nothing. Right? They just gave the property back to the fee simple owner. And then the Hawaiian system, they had a 3rd kind of ownership, which is called life estate. Now, life estate was a way to reward foreigners, for Hawaiian chiefs to reward foreigners for good deeds done, but not reward all their descendants forever. So, if you helped me, like Jarrett Judd Jarrett Judd helped to prevent France from taking over at one point. They might have given him a life estate. Here's land for you for the rest of your life. But your son didn't help us, your grandson didn't help us, we're not going to give the land and it goes down to them, just you, because you're the one who helped us. So that was a life estate. It's an early form of ownership. And the problem was the word for life estate in Hawaiian was, by people who didn't know how to speak Hawaiian, was often mistranslated as fee simple. It was, the word is allodial in English and allodio in Hawaiian, but they had a slight difference in the translation that people thought life estates were fee simples. And there are people living who think that they own land and they actually don't, because they trace back to a life estate. So these are some of the technicalities that are starting to come out. And that's just one layer of land, all of that. Below that is the sovereign's ownership of land, called dominium. So like the government can seize your property. If you live in the path of rail, right, they can take your house, they can condemn it, they pay you what they determine that it's worth, not the market value, but the value that they decide. And they own your house and they bulldoze it down and build rail through. The reason they can do that is because they actually own it. That's called dominion. So it's a layer of ownership that we don't usually think about. It's below, it lies, it's more fundamental than what we think of as ownership, like fee simple. And in the Hawaiian system, that sovereign ownership was divided in 3. The government, the konohiki or the chiefs, and the hoa'aina or the maka'aina or the commoners. Now this is where a lot of confusion comes up about this system, is that everybody thought that when they say 3 owners, that it was like a pie that was supposed to be divided into 3 pieces, but it's not a pie, it's like a layer cake, like what we saw. What we saw here. Okay, so people think about land as if it's 3-dimensional, as if it's 2-dimensional, just a pie that you slice into 3 pieces. But land in Hawaii is not 2-dimensional; it's 3-dimensional. It has the surface where you cut slices, but then it has depth. And the 3 owners, the king, who represents the government, the chiefs, or konehiki, and the makainana, or commoners, are like the 3 layers in the layer cake. So no matter, when you take a slice and you own a piece of land, every slice has 3 layers, no matter how small or large it is. It always has 3 owners. So what this means is in Hawaiian real estate, you don't actually own your land outright. There's always a possibility of some makainana having an interest, as they say, in your property. Now we saw that here on the windward side in Kahana Valley. In Kahana Valley, there was a woman named Mary Foster, very wealthy, who bought up Kahana piece by piece, about 98% of it. And if you look at the history, she was paying sometimes 3 or 4 times for the same exact plot of land. Now, why would you pay 3 or 4 times for the same land? There's another makainana who actually owns a piece of that. So she needs to pay that person off. Another nephew comes up, pay them off. And Mary Foster was part Hawaiian. She was very pro-Hawaiian, so she was somebody willing to do that. Nowadays, most people wouldn't be willing to pay 3 or 4 times for the same piece of land, right? That's how she acquired all this, the majority of Kahana Valley. That's a difficult thing to do because every land has multiple owners. So the depth here, the layers, are the rights. It's a right. And the top of it, the surface, is the actual thing, an object, a piece of land that you can actually do something with, right? When you have a right, it's not a thing. Now, like you have the right to vote, does that mean you did vote? No. It means you can vote. And once you do vote, do you still have the right to vote in that same election? No. You've given up the right to get an actual thing. You've divided out, you've given up your right. So these people could give up their right to get an actual thing. They could get out of this thickness of the cake and get an actual slice of cake. Once you have a slice of cake, you can do something with it. You can make a farm, you can build a house. But this is just potential, right? And so this is more like what land actually looked like, not a flat pie with 3 slices. Yeah? So even though the makainana got a small slice, altogether they got less than 1%. They always retain these fundamental rights to claim in the future. Does that make sense? Let me get back to the other one. Okay, and then, so that's just this part. That's a second layer. And there's a third layer, which are usage rights. So when you see access rights, access to the beach, that kind of thing, that's all, that's another layer of rights that sort of lies up on the top. Just to summarize it quickly, as a Native Hawaiian, Native Hawaiians have the right to gather on private land if it's undeveloped, and to cross private land to get to undeveloped land if that land is developed. So in other words, if somebody owns a piece of forest, a hula dancer can go and gather in that forest, even though it's private property. If they have a house with their yard and forest in the back, you can cross that yard to get to the forest in the back, even if all of that is private property. So you can't gather on someone's developed land right in their yard, but you can cross it. That's how these gathering rights exist right now in the state of Hawaii, because this has all been affirmed by the state. The kingdom's land system has been brought up into the state, and that's where some of these ruptures have happened, is because we have a kingdom system in an American state. So it's not the same here as other places in America.
So you could so the hula dancer could do that today.
Yeah.
And would just, and if challenged by the homeowner, would just have to prove their Hawaiian lineage, their Hawaiian heritage.
Yeah. So there's been debates about whether they, how much they have to prove.
Right.
And so a lot of those are still having to be settled in court. A few of them have. They've settled certain things are not gathering rights. There's a case in the kingdom that said grazing your horse is not a gathering right. But for the most part, Hawaiians have resisted defining those rights, arguing that Hawaiian culture is dynamic and always evolving. And so they don't want to lock it into just a few certain practices. The original practices were named gathering tea leaves, firewood, thatch for your house, and cordage to make rope. Those are specifically named things. But like say, for example, you want to make a feather cape. There's not enough of the birds that you would make a feather cape from up in the forest, so you have to use another kind of bird. So gathering that bird, could be a duck, becomes part of Hawaiian culture. So that's how Hawaiian culture changes, gathering rights have to change. That's what they're arguing. And the courts have more or less gone with that.
Just a really quick question about the using feathers.
Yeah.
Is there a humane way of doing that, or are birds always killed first?
Oh, traditionally they weren't killed because you just took one feather or two feathers.
From each bird?
Yeah, because these are birds like that have two yellow feathers.
Oh.
And those are the only ones you need, the rest. You just leave them and to grow back more.
They use like sap on like branches where the bird would usually go, like if the bird ate the fruit or something, then the bird would get stuck and then they release it after they pluck the feather.
I figured that they wouldn't harm the bird. That seems to be contrary.
Yeah, they're kind of like rare birds too, those mountain birds
Yeah.
with the nice colors.
So this is a map of Kuleana, the land grants that Maka'ainana got. They're small, they tend to be landlocked. And the reason they're small is because you were given the land that you were cultivating. The average was 3 acres. And if you've ever tried to cultivate land, you'll find 3 acres is actually a lot to try to keep in cultivation. I have a hard time cultivating a little strip of, it's like a 10 feet or 12 feet by 18 inches in my backyard. It's pretty hard to keep everything alive. 3 acres is a lot. But one thing is they're also landlocked, And so they had to have all these layers of rights, like the right to get to your property. And sometimes those rights were taken away probably illegally, but those are what kuleanas are. They're just little properties which are taken out of another person's land. So like a chief would get an entire ahupua'a, but the maka'anana living on that, in that ahupua'a, would cut out little pieces from that. So the chief would be left with, in this picture, all the green, all the stuff that's not in cultivation, unless they themselves are cultivating a piece. So that's another set of layers. And this is why Hawaiian land tenure was called feudal, because you had a lord and then vassals underneath actually working on the land. It looked a lot like feudalism. And in the 1800s, nobody questioned the idea that Hawaiian land tenure was feudal. My argument is, of course, it's not feudal. It's not actually feudal, but there's some similarities in the sense that there are layers of owners. The chief would own the green and actually have management of the fisheries in the ocean. And then the water in the stream was government property. So this process of separating out all the rights, who owns what, was a pretty tricky one in the kingdom, and we're still seeing the effects of trying to figure out what exactly they did back then. And the more we look at it, the more we see that they kind of did know what they were doing. They might not have realized the difficulties that we have today. If you want to know why land in Hawaii is so expensive, just look back to the original owners. There are only less than 9,000 of them. So every piece of land in Hawaii goes back to 9,000 original owners. There are 912,000 people just on Oahu now. So we have 100 times as many more as people living here, competing for the same amount of land that 9,000 people had. And that's why it's so expensive. Okay. So the Mahele, the Mahele, oh, here we go again. The Mahele came before the Kuleana Act, but the reason that I put Kuleana, the chapter Kuleana first, is that the idea of Kuleana underlies the process of the Mahele. The Kuleana were this basic ownership here. The idea that Maka'anana owned the land in common with the king and the chiefs. And that was more fundamental than the Mahele. So when these two layers divide out and they get their property, that's the Mahele. When the Maka'anana do it and they get their property, that's the Kuleana Act. So they're really the same process, just in two steps. And the reason that they did these top two first is because if they had done them all at the same time, Maka'anana would end up with two landlords. They would end up with a chief above them and the king above that chief. I don't know if you have landlords, but landlords are a pain. Right? They always want to take your deposit, never give it back to you. They do things like, I'm just going to keep your deposit to kind of fix the place up. They're a pain. Why would you want two landlords? So they want to make sure that every maka'anana only had one landlord, either the chief or the king. And so the Mahele was actually a division just between the king and the chiefs. They split the land in two, and then the Maka'anana claimed their pieces out of those two, and that's the Kuleana Act. But it's the same process. It's going from the right to an object, an actual piece of land. It's the same process. Does that make sense? It is kind of complicated. But.
Mm-hmm.
So, in my sixth chapter, I look at that next period after the overthrow. Sanford Dole, who was the head of the provisional government and the Republic of Hawaii, he was a judge in the kingdom. He was smart enough to know that there was such a thing as native tenant rights. The native tenants had the right to get land. And so they came up with a number of responses. I call them responses, ways of suppressing those rights. Because it's hard to build a plantation system on land that's not owned in a normal fee simple, where there are multiple owners. They wanted to kind of squelch those rights. Oh shoot, oops. So I'll just go over what those were. One of them was a lawsuit in 1895 that said that native tenant rights were over, that you couldn't exercise them anymore. Which is kind of interesting because most people think that native tenant right, the right to divide out your interest and get your land, was ended in 1848. So just the fact that they're saying in 1895 that they're over suggests that they weren't over. Right? This is 50 years later. That's one of the arguments I make in my dissertation, is that there was no deadline to native tenant rights because makainana are always being born. As a makainana, you're born with a right. It doesn't just go away just because somebody sets a deadline. But in 1895, they set a legal precedent that there's no more native tenant rights. And then they set up something called the land court. And the land court is a second system of registering property. So the first system has this crazy name called the regular system. That's really the name of it, the regular system. So you register your land, you say, I own this land, you go file it with this bureau, and you say, I own this land, and they keep the record. Well, in Hawaii, we have a second system, the land court. And this is a more politicized system where you bring a bunch of maps and records, and they give you a second deed. So if you ever buy land, you might see it says on the documents which system is it registered in. And if it's on Oahu, usually it'll be regular system and land court system. On the outer islands, a lot of times it'll just be regular system. So what they did was they gave the plantations away. Basically, they gave the plantations away to cover up any cloud on the title. Right? There's like this family that has this that has a right to this land. Well, let's just make that go away by filing some forms with the land court, and the land court gives you a second deed. So you can have property with two deeds, and those second deeds have never been overturned. So that's a real issue. And Dole was the one who brought the system in. He was very much aware of these rights that Hawaiians had, and thinking of ways to kind of crush them, and also maybe make people forget about them. Finally, I looked at the question of alienation. How was land actually lost? You know, there's this thing that you hear Hawaiians say, land was stolen. Keanusai, who came to speak to us, is actually a felon convicted of stealing land, attempting to steal land. But if you actually look at the definition of theft, it's taking personal property. In other words, not real property, not real estate. You can't steal land because land is immovable. Right? You can steal a ship, that's called mutiny. You can steal a computer, that's theft, but you can't steal land. You can have a dispute over who owns the land, or you can trespass. There's no such thing as stealing land. And yet the Supreme Court of Hawaii upheld a conviction of stealing land. of Keanu, but they never sentenced him to any prison time. They just sort of put it on the record. So what I'm saying is that even you can't have it both ways. If Keanu couldn't steal land, neither could the Hawaiʻi people, right? So how did they end up owning the land? It was, legal theft, you might say. Sometimes it was simply private purchase. And that started in 1850. Sometimes land was just sold, and then descendants of Hawaiians forget that their ancestors sold the land, and they're complaining about loss of land, but actually it was just sold. Although sometimes in the very early days, when there was a transaction, the two sides might not have understood what was going on, right? Like, what's the term for those people who give you something and then take it back? Indian givers. Well, where do you think that term came from? Probably Indians who had sold to Westerners the right to use land, and at the end of that usage, they expect the land to be returned because land can't be sold. And yet the Westerners are saying, you're taking back something that you've given to me or sold to me. You're an Indian giver. Hawaiians were charged with being Indian givers in some cases. But there's very well documented cases in New Zealand, especially, of the Maori in New Zealand having a different understanding of what happened in a transaction that was supposed to be a sale. It wasn't actually a sale. It was a usage right. So sometimes these private purchases weren't completely legit. That's one method. Another method is confiscation. So a lot of confiscation happened right after annexation. All the big military bases, the older ones, Schofield, Shafter especially, were simply taken by executive order. And then there was other confiscation from the ceded lands. And then there were legal mechanisms. The most well-known one is adverse possession. Adverse possession is a technique of getting control of land by maintaining a piece of property for a period of, it used to be 10 and then they changed it to 20 years. Now, maintaining could be simply putting up a gate or a fence or a ditch or a sign. And what would often happen would be a Hawaiian got land from the Kuleana Act, but they have no money to start a farm. So they leave and they work for a plantation, and they're making, 40 cents a day, and so they can't save. Plus, most of that goes right back to the plantation store, right? So they have a really hard time saving. 10 years goes by, or more, and they finally come back to their land and they find out that a plantation manager has been maintaining that land all along, and then they can prove it in court, and they go to court and they get possession of that land. The idea is what they call highest and best use, that land should be put to the highest and best use, the most economically productive use that it can be. And so don't leave land in the ownership of people who don't put it to good use. Switch the ownership to somebody who's going to use it better. And that's what adverse possession is based on. Occasionally Hawaiians have benefited from adverse possession, but in the vast majority of cases it's been plantations taking land from native tenants. So that's adverse possession, that's one of the legal mechanisms. Another is just foreclosure. Foreclosures were going on in the kingdom. There's a book by Robert Stauffer about Kahana that shows how big foreclosures were in terms of a mechanism of Hawaiian land loss. That a lot of these foreclosures were done without any court oversight, and they were private loans. So you have land, but you're land rich, cash poor. you need some money, you borrow from your neighbor, probably your holiday neighbor, but it's a short-term loan. It's like 3 years, high interest, the full amount due at the end of 3 years. And if you don't meet those terms, they end up owning your land. Right? So it's a straight foreclosure. It's just, in the kingdom days, it was on terms that would never be acceptable today. Right? It was really aggressive lending practices. And the final mechanism is one I call erasure, where the cultural memory of the land was simply erased. And what would happen often was a Hawaiian had a Kuleana, and it was marked off by landmarks. A large boulder there, a tree, a ridge, and so on. And that Hawaiian would maybe lease his land to a plantation, and then he'd leave to Honolulu, and meanwhile the plantation would erase all of those markers and combine it with the next Kuleana land lots all around. And the Hawaiian would come back and he couldn't even find his Kuleana land. It was somewhere hidden in that giant field of sugarcane, completely gone. So it's what they call palena, or the boundaries of the loss of that cultural memory. Sometimes it would be the children would come back and say, "Where's my father's land?" There'd be a new manager of the plantation, and he'd open up a safe and he'd say, "Well, here's a bunch of leases we have, but I don't know anything about it." And the land would just be erased, and now would be belonging to Alexander Baldwin or Castle Cook or Pioneer Miller, whoever it was. So in my final conclusion, I looked at what does it really mean today in the context of globalization. Right now we have a global real estate market. Those glossy real estate magazines are not really for you and me. They're for wealthy people who come here and want to buy a retirement home, or they have $1 million or $2 million to throw around, and those people start displacing the natives. But on the other hand, Hawaiians actually have built up through the trusts pretty sizable amounts of assets, both cash and land. And I actually compiled this chart for an OHA campaign I worked on. You can probably guess who that was for. But when you look at it, and these numbers are, if anything, are larger now. You have between OHA and Hawaiian Homes, if you can count those, but certainly Kamehameha Schools and Queens Hospital, that's the Queen Emma Land Company, and the Okalani Children's Center, Luna Liga Home. They have millions of acres, hundreds of thousands of acres of land, and billions in assets, really. And so this can be a starting point. There is an effort to sort of make the trusts start to work together towards common goals instead of just fractured on their specific goals, to try to see if all these assets can be leveraged to have bigger things happen. So, there's two sides of the story. There's all these rights that are kind of left unclaimed, and yet even within that, Hawaiians have been able to build up pretty sizable asset bases, especially within the trusts. And I'll stop there and we can take a break, and then if you have any questions afterwards.